You should be able to see the diagram that I've put up here, right?
Yeah, I can see it.
Cool. So one of the things you're going to encounter in any of your interviews with FANG is, first off, almost all of them use kind of a panel style interview, right? So initially, you'll probably have like a phone screen, um, predominantly by like a recruiter, and they're just kind of making sure that you're aligned, you're aware of the role and all that. And then usually you'll get a technical screen right after, which is also usually a phone session. Sometimes it's a Zoom. And from there, you'll kind of usually go through your own background and more talk about yourself and your experiences, and maybe ask a couple questions here and there. But it's really more kind of discussion style than actual Q&A. And then when you get through that, you'll go through, the different loops or panels, and each of them do it different. Amazon's is kind of a panel or a series of interviews where you're doing one-on-ones with 4 different people, and then they kind of meet up and chat after the fact. Google's is very, very similar, and I think Facebook actually does them kind of all at once or together. But part of that for all of them is you'll have a whiteboarding session or a technical presentation. And in the case of Amazon and Google, I'm not entirely sure about Facebook or Apple. You'll typically be given an architecture ahead of time, and it'll look something like this in terms of detail, depending on what cloud platform. The icons might be different, or the labels might be different. And you'll get presented with a series of questions or kind of a scenario. So citing mine, right, when I joined Amazon, I got an architecture similar to this, and I got asked the question, your customer is trying to make this more resilient or redundant. What kinds of changes would you make in this architecture to make it more fault tolerant? Another question I got was, if your customer is looking to get to pass a PCI audit in some near kind of term, what are some areas that you would look to kind of dive into or assess from a security standpoint to identify what kinds of things they might need to do to ensure that they're compliant with PCI regulations, and what kinds of recommendations would I make from a security perspective to kind of address that architecture. For something that's more TPM or red or blue team, you're probably going to see an architecture diagram like this and be asked a question like, how would you conduct a threat assessment or a threat model of this application? Or what would be some key areas that you would try to kind of assess or pen test against? Or what would be some specific areas that you would recommend or security controls that you would recommend to protect this from a specific type of threat, whether they say an insider threat or an external threat or what have you. So the expectation isn't necessarily that you're just going to be like this cloud expert, hands-on kind of person that's just going to jump into the command line and implement a bunch of stuff, but you definitely need to understand like what each of these services are, at least at a high level, right? Like DynamoDB is a database, Archive to Glacier is like storage with S3, and I know S3 is storage, okay? I know Direct Connect is like a tunnel from point to point, okay? Like I understand, those things. You don't have to necessarily know all the ins and outs, but being able to, at a high level, know what types of services are is important. And then taking a look at how you would perform whatever function they're asking you, again, at a high level, right? And so understanding like what regions are, what the different components of the cloud are in terms of like redundancy and taking backups. So being able to say, well, you would want to take snapshots, or you would want MFA for, this or that, or talking about where you would look to minimize access, right? Like, okay, I would take a look at my database there, and I would make sure that I don't have, users that I don't need. I would reduce the access of anything that's going to connect to this database to the bare minimum that I need. And I would set up, like firewalls or network controls like security groups that would minimize the traffic that can go to that server. so on and so forth. And so the expectation will just be for you to be able to kind of talk through that stuff. And in some cases, if you happen to go on site for whatever reason, or I know some of the companies are using things like Miro, actually draw on this kind of diagram and kind of talk through those changes will be generally how your like deep technical interviews are going to go. Any questions on that?
So, if somebody is looking towards the management or a TPM kind of role, right? That's it will have a different interviews, right? Like we might be they might be looking at the architecture or the design interview and behavioral and domain. Will that be one interview or two interviews for domain?
Yeah, it depends on the company that you're interviewing with. Even for managers, they'll frequently still have kind of a technical session, and they'll just kind of be grading you differently instead of making sure that your what you're actually saying to do, like the technical aspect is like accurate. They'll be focusing on your presentation skills themselves, and so sometimes your presentation will be a little bit different. They'll be having you talk about how you're going to structure the team or scale the team or do different things, but frequently there's only one whiteboarding session. And so if the expectation for the interview is that you kind of whiteboard or present something, it'll just be done in one interview. Typically the other interviews in a panel are more kind of behavioral or situational. They'll be looking to either understand how you would approach a specific type of situation or identifying if you're like a culture fit. Like for example, in the case of Amazon and GCP, or sorry, Google, both of which they'll have like their tenets or leadership principles. And the goal of the interview will be to try to assess, to what extent you're a good candidate that meets those principles. And generally their approach is you don't have to be perfect. All you need to do is, kind of be better than like 50% of the existing people or better than, kind of the running average of the group. So even if you're not slam dunking it for a role or in a specific domain, the bar isn't always that high. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
And Sunil, what Daniel was talking about goes really well with what I was talking about earlier about having examples, especially for like the soft skills or checking to see if you're a culture fit. They're going to ask you some questions, that you should be prepared to answer no matter what. Like, for example, name a time when you did something like you messed up, right? Now they're not just wanting to hear that you messed up. They're wanting to hear how you messed up. Did you take responsibility? How did you fix it? Did you learn from it? Right? Like if you don't go in with thinking of having those examples, it's a simple thing, but it can really like sink you, right? Because it could just be like a big red flag because everybody's messed up, right? So if you can't think of something, that's really going to make you look bad. So there's just some things that you can just do as a basic preparation that, like have an example for that. You should also have an example of, that time when you disagreed with somebody, right? What was the situation? Just that, like, I'd say you want to have like 4 or 5 of those in your pocket, ready to just talk about, and think about, think of them through, like what was the situation, and you want to present it such that, no matter what happened, that, you learn from it and you look better afterward. That makes sense?
Yep, it does.
Quick question on the diagram. How much time do you usually have to review it? Do they give it to you like that day or 2 days?
No, it's usually quite a bit before. So for Amazon, you'll typically get like a week. Google will also usually give you about a week, sometimes more. Like I haven't gone through, like I said, the Facebook or the Meta process, but it's pretty common for you to get it like a day or two at a minimum ahead of time. The goal is not necessarily to test you like on the spot. The goal is to give you the opportunity to prepare ahead of time and then see what you can bring to the table after having that preparation. And so usually you'll have a couple nights to kind of plan and figure it all out. And then what they'll do is, in addition to the questions that you were asked ahead of time, right, that might come with the scenario, sometimes they'll throw a couple curveballs. And so they might add a couple extra things. Well, what if, they said they wanted to, increase throughput just to the database? Or what if they want to make sure that their S3 bucket is more secure because they're going to put sensitive data in it, or what have you? And so for the most part, you'll have a lot of preparation time, and then here and there, they might throw a couple on the spot questions, but usually it's those questions are usually more about like leveling or kind of gauging the depth of your experience more than like kind of a pass or fail, like should we hire or not hire this person? And so typically those curveballs are there to help determine what level you should be at.
Thanks.
Yeah. One of the kind of big themes for FANG companies that are a little bit different than some others is almost all of them, as part of their hiring training, really emphasize like to their interviewers that it's not just a quest to like stump you. They really have kind of some more purpose behind their stuff. And so you really might be surprised at how little direct technical questions you might get compared to what you might be fearing potentially in some of the big FANG interviews. A lot of them are really, really focused on your strategy, your approach, your ability to learn, your ability to troubleshoot and critically think, as well as your ability to kind of like communicate and work with a team. And so especially as you're thinking about, your own examples and picking out scenarios from your experiences, really paying some diligence to where those examples should demonstrate your ability there will also go pretty far. Even if you don't quite hit the technical mark on stuff, because there's so much demand in the market right now, most of the big companies are willing to teach you. For example, when I got hired at AWS, I had never touched AWS before then. I literally, and I was open about it. I told them, I've never done any of this. And I walked into my interview saying, like, I've never actually, worked in an environment that uses AWS, but I read up, like you gave me a week. So I went and studied, and here's what I learned. And here's, what I would do based on what I know, as well as, the types of things that I would approach this with, using my experience in an on-premise or, a DoD environment. And they loved it. I got pretty high marks, essentially a unanimous vote to be hired in, which is pretty uncommon in some cases. So it's not always just about like, do you know the in and outs of every single service in the given platform, and more of just demonstrating essentially that you're a good worker that can learn and adapt and think critically.
Yeah, I would add too that they're not going to grade you as much on your AWS knowledge as much as just on your general technical knowledge. Like it sounds like you have previous data center or non-cloud experience, and that'll benefit you, right? Because ultimately cloud is still using those technologies, right? It's removed, right? It's just abstracted in a sense. So like a common, and just to add to what Daniel was saying about the interview techniques, a lot of them, they want to be broad or open, because then you really can just kind of see how deep the candidate is. So like a perfect example is one that I think was asked almost every single time I was part of an interview, is like, the question is, let's say that you're at your computer and you go to Amazon.com, like describe everything that happens from you pressing enter to going, right? And like, if you think about it, of course, you can really get down into the depths of like DNS and HTTPS and web servers and like a host table, like everything, right? So the questions are there to really gauge your depth, and then the subsequent questions will kind of just be to kind of tease out what you know. So your previous knowledge is good, because it'll show that kind of that's where let's say that's what you gravitate towards, and kind of show your technical ability or your aptitude, let's say, for the cloud. Did we want to go to our third question, or did you guys have any questions?
And that was going to be my next approach, is jumping into the rest of these here.
So from a technical perspective, are there major differences triaging and doing forensics on cloud and containers to physical on-prem hosts? How do you deal with containers being ephemeral? Is there
I can jump into that. So from a IR standpoint, right, there are a lot of parallels in that kind of the EDR and a lot of the third-party tools and different things are still in use, right? Like we're still using Incase or what have you to do autopsies against assets in the cloud and different things like that. We're still using, the CrowdStrike and the FireEye kind of technologies to contain and detect or perform different things against cloud endpoints, even against EC2 instances, and in many cases also containers. To your question, there are a lot of challenges with containers, but most of those aren't really around the fact that they're ephemeral. It's more around who's hosting the container. So for example, in AWS, there's kind of two types of container services. There's ones where you're running the orchestration and setting up your hosts and then running the containers. And in those cases, it's really not too bad because you have access to the host directly. You can still use all the same tools for the most part to kind of capture memory and do the different things that you need to do to perform forensics. Where we really run into a lot of challenges is with like Fargate and similar services where the host itself is actually abstracted away from you and you're just getting the containers as a service. Because you don't have access to the underlying host anymore, a lot of the third-party tools don't support it, and a lot of the kind of open source and different tooling that you might use yourself aren't going to work because you're not able to pull kind of runtime or memory or different things out of that host that's being provided as a service. So that's really where the challenge comes in with containers. In terms of them being like ephemeral or short-lived, that's where kind of the logging and some of the other security best practices come into play, where you're looking at an incident and the container that something might have happened on is gone by the time you're looking at it. You're really relying heavily on your logging to understand like what happened while it was alive. And then the other thing you're looking at is kind of real-time analytics and understanding what your containers are actually doing. And so that's where you're starting to look at those EDR solutions, or maybe a very kind of well-managed SIEM where you've got some custom alerts and different things like that. But the challenges you're going to see there are more around the maturity of organizations. Like it's pretty uncommon for an organization to be so mature that they're able to create like high fidelity alerts for those ephemeral instances. Usually the kind of rate of innovation and change for their app teams exceeds the rate of generating kind of alarm rules within the security departments. And so what you'll see is people start getting a lot of false positives and they kind of wind down those efforts. And so you're not getting that real-time notification, so to speak, that you might get from more static architectures where you can build kind of robust high fidelity rule sets over time and tune out noise. So really for containers, it's very, very heavy in logging, monitoring, and then focusing on securing those gold images to make them kind of hard to compromise in the first place. I think the latter half of that is working on the actual forensics and triaging. There's a number of different options that you have. What we actually do at Red Ventures and what we would build for customers here and there on the professional services side is kind of quick deployment templates that are going to help you essentially contain infrastructure within that cloud environment, right? So we'd be either having kind of security groups always hot and ready that essentially block everything and logically contain an instance, or focusing on kind of CloudFormation templates that would very quickly deploy something like that, as well as in some cases config rules or SCP rules and things like that that would kind of help immediately shut down some of the access or capability that certain architectures might have. In addition, for the actual forensics, you're really looking at taking snapshots and kind of digital copies of things. That's actually a little bit easier in the cloud than it is in on-prem. And then bringing those up in usually like a sandbox or forensics lab kind of environment where you're going to have your tool set like Autopsy and Incase and different things pre-deployed on EC2 instances or something. And you'll just kind of attach an EBS volume and then take a look at it. Just like, the on-premise version of grabbing a hard drive out of a machine and then going and plugging it in to your forensics device in some lab somewhere. And so it's very much the same kind of procedures, the same kind of tools. They just live in the cloud now instead of in a kind of isolated lab environment. And so, especially and pen testing, you're also still seeing Kali Linux and a lot of the same tools that come in with Kali. So some organizations are putting Kali directly on EC2 instances. There's Marketplace for all three cloud platforms, and within all three of their marketplaces, there are Kali VMs that you can kind of buy or lease or spin up. And it comes with all those same kind of tool sets, as well as just deploying kind of standalone versions of the different tools that are in Kali so that you can use kind of like Burp and Nessus and different things to do kind of your assessments. And so all the methodology is largely the same. A lot of the tools are the same. You're just deploying them a little differently, taking advantage of the flexibility of the cloud because you can spin things up and spin them down and kind of whatnot. So it's about the same. I think as far as things I've encountered or common mistakes, common compromises, it's these days, it's always misconfiguration. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say we covered it a bit, but the two most common I'd say by far are unpatched resources, just because that's essentially just kind of like leaving your key under the mat, right? Like there's a popular software will have a known issue. There'll be an exploit that's put out in the wild, and if you don't patch, the thing is, a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, they just don't have a good patching strategy, right? They're not aware of it, or they are, but they don't do a good job. So that's just like, it's easy money, right? Like just how you can always phish somebody, like you're always gonna be able to phish an organization no matter what. You can always get in through that as well. So I'd say that's really common. Another one is just like we were saying before, of the improper access. It's super easy for people to just flip things to be public, or maybe they have a server, an EC2 in a subnet that they think is private, but then let's say maybe they're not familiar with what they're doing and they attach an IGW to the subnet. Well, all of a sudden now it's private, or now what was a private subnet is now a public subnet, right? So I'd say that's pretty common. I just circle back to the metadata because I've actually been asked that metadata question as well. So yeah, I would definitely recommend if you're doing any kind of interview, it would be good to be familiar with that, because really that's a way to kind of just it's almost like a backdoor into the environment to be able to query that service, because you just get so much information. That can kind of lead to compromise as well, right? If you're able to query like the EC2 metadata service or what have you. As far as how the compromises happen, really, really typical, common, like what did the criminals actually do, right? Would be like ransomware or crypto mining. So, the big breaches, the one where like the really good state actors and they're just trying to get data or whatever, really they're good enough that almost they won't be caught. But what's more common is that you'll just have these kind of lower to mid tier criminals, which will just be kind of just running, rampant roughshod over resources, and they're just wanting to get money, right? So the quickest ways they can get money, ransomware, because it encrypts, and they can, they can request Bitcoin or whatever, Monero, whatever your cryptocurrency of choice. But those I'd say are common like use cases of what they're going to do, and those actually aren't really terrible outcomes, because they're not really concerned with the data, right? Like let's say you have a sensitive server that has, like, let's say customer credit card data. A lot of the times they're not even concerned with like what's on the box. They're just wanting to just steal a resource. So it's important to like know what their objective is, and you can kind of know as a result of like what like what do they do once they gained access to the box. And that kind of leads into your fifth one. What are the most helpful logs? So every single time I've ever had an AWS let's say compromised CloudTrail, you're always going to look at, right? Especially if it's anything involved with a user compromise, because you're going to be wanting to check like what resources were created, what resources were deleted, what users are created, right? So CloudTrail, any kind of log that is recording the API activity. NetFlow is going to be probably your second most important, or maybe first most. With AWS, that's VPC flow logs. So that's just going to be telling you like, was there like indeed, like you might have to answer, was there exfiltration of this sensitive data off this box? And using NetFlow, using VPC flow logs, you could say, oh yeah, I was able to see that the attacker who logged in from such and such IP then was sending the information back, and you could track like they sent 50 megabytes or 5 gigabytes or whatever, right? So those logs are very important. The third one, I would say, it's going to be whatever resource that was actually dealt with the compromise. So like, let's say it was S3, it's going to be like the detailed object level logging. Like if it's EC2, then it's going to be whatever logs that you have there on board in like, let's say var/logs if it's a Linux instance. So yeah, and to kind of get to your second part, where are cloud logs in general lacking? Exactly, that's a great question, because they're lacking in the part where basically you're going to have your kind of standard log set up like your CloudTrail, but that's all going to be service level. Your actual resource level logs is something that you need to set up as well, or in addition to, let's say. So that's something that you'd want to call out, especially in an interview, to say like, well, if an EC2 instance is compromised, I could go and look on the box, but are you sending those logs out to a central location? Do you have a sensor or something installed to pull those logs? You know what I mean? What visibility is commonly lacking during cloud forensics? Daniel, did you have any thoughts on that last part?
Yeah, so in terms of kind of 3 log sources, right? When you approach an incident, your first task is identifying like what has happened, and then in conjunction to that, what things were affected by it. And so to Troy's point, like CloudTrail or like the actual platform logs can be really, really good. And pretty much everybody does a decent job of enabling those things. Very, very few orgs like really fail at that. Where you'll really see people commonly not have the logs is NetFlow. And the reason is because there's not a ton of value outside of security, right? Like application teams aren't really using them to troubleshoot much, and different things like that. And there's also just a ton of volume and a ton of noise. And so usually it's like a cost concern for an org. And that's kind of crippling, because when you're faced with the task of, for example, identifying if there was lateral movement as part of an incident or an attack, or simply identifying where traffic is going after something is being executed on a box, right? Commonly in an attack, the first thing somebody's going to do is set up command and control, and then try to use that initial point to pivot or do lateral movement. And without NetFlow logs, it can be really difficult to identify if that has happened already or is still in progress, or if it's already happened somewhere else and you're actually only detecting the actual lateral movement. So it's very, very kind of important in your incident response to have that NetFlow. And to kind of pivot off that, sometimes firewall logs or WAF logs specifically can kind of help provide that same kind of information. So there's some overlap there. And then I think also to Troy's point, the next big piece that very, very few orgs really do well is application logging, right? Understanding what's happening at that application layer. And so that might be, the application might be S3 or a storage service, or it could be an actual application that the group is, has authored themselves and is providing service to their customers. And so understanding what that application is doing is pretty important. It kind of just depends on the nature of the attack, right? For vulnerability-based stuff, you're usually exploiting like the underlying host, versus with a lot of your cross-site scripting or really kind of application-focused attacks, you're looking at something coming in through the API, manipulating different things that the application can do, and accessing like the database or different things that the application is functioning at. And without application logs, you're not going to know what's happening, right? Your next bet, like I was in an incident a while back where those logs weren't present. We didn't have NetFlow, we didn't have application logs. And so when the question was presented, like, could they have gotten to our data? We literally had to pull like a massive history of database logs and then try to baseline the database activity and like the requests against the database over a long period of time, and then just hope that the attacker would have done something out of the ordinary that we could detect just by seeing like, did we get a spike in requests, or did we see, like a dump table kind of thing. So if the attacker happened to do low and slow, or if they were doing anything like that appeared to be normal, we would have no real way of finding it. And so in that org, it was kind of troublesome for us to really define the scope and impact of that incident, because we knew we're really just making kind of a best guess. And so those are some kind of examples of the different logs that are really important. I think, if you had to pick three, you probably won't see a question like that. You'll probably see questions more like, if this logging doesn't exist, what would you do to like figure things out? Or, what's your best effort kind of response look like? And so really just understanding how to use what you have for each log source is probably your best bet to prep for that kind of interview.
Want to become a software engineer at Google? You can, like thousands of our students. You just need to learn from those who've already cleared FANG interviews. At Interview Kickstart, our interview prep courses are developed and taught live by 150 plus instructors from Tier 1 companies like Google and Facebook. Our courses are tailored to help you crack software engineering domain interviews, including back-end, full stack, machine learning, embedded systems, data science, and more. To learn more, book your 3 webinar slot today